The stagecoach wheels ground to a violent halt in the choking dust of Ember Creek's main street. The horses snorting and stamping as Clara Fields gathered her courage and her worn carpetbag. 3 weeks of bone-jarring travel from St. Louis had led to this moment, this chance at redemption, at belonging, at becoming Mrs. Marcus Brand, in a territory where second chances were as rare as spring rain. Clara smoothed her best blue dress with trembling hands, knowing the fabric strained against her fuller figure, but clinging to the hope that love might overlook what vanity condemned. The telegram in her pocket, creased from countless desperate readings, had promised a good Christian home and a man who valued character over convention. She'd poured her heart into their correspondence, sharing her seamstress skills, her dreams of children and garden plots, her gentle humor that had sustained her through years of factory drudgery and boarding house misery. Sheriff Marcus Brand emerged from the gathering crowd like a predator sensing wounded prey. Tall and lean, with a silver star pinned to his black vest, he approached with the swagger of a man who'd never questioned his own authority. His pale blue eyes swept over Clara, with the clinical assessment of a livestock appraiser lingering on her rounded hips, the way her dress pulled tight across her bosom, the hopeful smile that died on her lips under his cold scrutiny. The silence stretched like a hangman's rope, while half the town watched from wooden sidewalks and storefront doorways. Children peeked around their mothers' skirts, sensing drama, but not understanding its cruelty. Men shifted from foot to foot, some nodding approval at what was coming, others studying their boots in anticipation of shame. They lacked the courage to prevent. "You, Clara Fields." Brand's voice carried across the street with the force of a public announcement, drawing more spectators from alleys and businesses. "Yes, sir." Clara's voice came out smaller than intended, her throat already tight with the bitter taste of impending humiliation. "I'm pleased to finally meet—" "Well, I ain't pleased at all." Brand spat tobacco juice into the dirt at her feet, the brown stain spattering across her travel-worn boots. "Letter said you were a fine woman of good character. Didn't mention you were built like a broodmare looking for an easy meal." The words hit Clara like physical blows, each syllable designed for maximum public impact. Gasps and nervous laughter rippled through the crowd. Mrs. Garrett from the bank covered her mouth in mock horror, while her eyes gleamed with malicious pleasure. The blacksmith shook his head and turned away, unwilling to witness what he lacked the backbone to stop. Clara felt heat flood her cheeks, felt 28 years of accumulated shame and rejection crushing down on her shoulders like desert stones. The photograph she'd sent, taken 5 years earlier, when grief and poverty had carved 20 pounds from her frame, suddenly felt like the cruelest of deceptions, though she'd included it in honest hope, not calculated fraud. "The photograph I sent was recent," she managed, though her voice cracked like thin ice. "I never intended to mislead. Must have been taken with one of them magic lenses they got back east." Brand's cruel smile widened as the crowd's amusement grew, feeding on itself like wildfire. "I asked for a wife, not some fat cow desperate enough to lie her way into any man's bed. Find yourself another fool, lady. This town's got standards." He turned his back on her with theatrical finality, his boots clicking on the wooden walkway as he strode toward the saloon. The crowd began to disperse like smoke, some shaking their heads in theatrical sympathy, others whispering behind cupped hands about the deceiving woman who tried to trap the sheriff. The stagecoach driver was already unhitching his horses, avoiding Clara's desperate gaze with the practiced indifference of a man who'd seen too many dreams die in desert towns. Clara stood alone in the street with her carpetbag at her feet and nowhere to run. $3.47, that was the sum total of her worldly wealth. The return fare to St. Louis would cost more than she'd see in 6 months, assuming she could find work in this godforsaken place that had already marked her as unworthy of basic human dignity. A child's voice pierced the settling dust. "Mama, why was the sheriff so mean to that lady?" "Now hush now," came the sharp reply. Some people bring their troubles on themselves. Clara's hands shook as she lifted her bag, the weight of it, nothing compared to the crushing realization that she'd traveled 1,000 miles to be destroyed in front of strangers. The desert sun beat down mercilessly, already promising the kind of heat that killed unprepared travelers, while the jagged mountains that ringed Ember Creek stood like prison walls against any hope of escape. As the last of the crowd drifted away, Clara Fields understood with crystalline clarity that she had two choices: find a way to survive in this hostile place or die trying. There would be no third option, no merciful rescue, no return to the life she'd fled in desperate hope of something better. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and alkali dust, and Clara tasted the bitter flavor of a future she'd have to fight for with every breath in her body. "Now you planning to take root in that spot?" The voice belonged to a woman approaching from the Ember Inn across the street, stocky, gray-haired, wearing a flour-dusted apron over practical brown calico. Her face showed the weathering of 50-odd years in unforgiving country. But her eyes held something Clara had almost forgotten existed: unprejudiced assessment. "I'm Ruth Garrison. Run that establishment behind you." She studied Clara with the frank gaze of someone accustomed to making quick judgments about character. "Heard what Brand done? Man's lower than snake shit, but that don't solve your immediate problem." Clara's throat felt too tight for words. 3 minutes in Ember Creek, and she'd found more kindness from a stranger than she'd received from the man who'd promised to cherish her. "I don't have money for a room," Clara whispered. "Didn't ask if you did. Got space in the stable loft that's dry and warm enough. You can work it off helping with laundry, cooking, whatever needs doing." Ruth picked up Clara's bag without ceremony. "Come on before you pass out from standing in this heat like a lost calf." They crossed the street together, Ruth's boots clicking decisively on sun-baked wood, while Clara fought the urge to look back at the place of her humiliation. The Ember Inn was larger than it appeared from outside, 2 stories, with a restaurant on the ground floor and 8 guest rooms above. The smell of beef stew and cornbread made Clara's empty stomach clench with a hunger that went beyond food to encompass everything she'd lost and might never find again. "Most folks here ain't evil," Ruth said, pushing through batwing doors into blessed shade. "Just scared. Hard times make people mean, and Brand feeds on that like a tick on a dog." She glanced around the empty dining room, its mismatched tables and chairs, speaking of a business that survived rather than prospered. Town's been losing people for months. Silver mines playing out water, getting scarcer every year. When folks get scared, they need someone to blame who ain't them. Clara followed Ruth through a kitchen that showed the efficiency of long practice, then out a back door to a small stable housing 2 horses and a milk cow. A ladder led to a hayloft that smelled of sweet grass and leather, where Ruth had already laid out a thin blanket and a flour sack pillow. "Ain't the Palmer house," Ruth said, "but it'll keep you alive while we sort things out." "Why are you helping me?" Clara asked, though she dreaded hearing pity in the answer. Ruth paused at the ladder, her weathered face thoughtful. "Had a sister once prettier than a spring flower. Everyone said she'd marry well, live fine. She picked a handsome man who beat her to death in a cabin outside Denver when she couldn't give him sons." Her voice carried old pain, kept carefully controlled. "Sometimes I think if she'd been plain like me, she might have chose a man for his character instead of his smile." Alone in the loft as afternoon faded to evening, Clara unpacked her meager possessions, 2 dresses, undergarments that had seen better years, her precious sewing kit, 3 books, and a daguerreotype of her parents on their wedding day, young and hopeful, before life taught them the cost of dreams. She pressed her face to the small window, watching Ember Creek settle into the uneasy quiet that marked frontier towns after dark. A man emerged from the shadows between buildings, tall and broad-shouldered, moving with the careful gait of someone who'd learned to watch for trouble. He wore work clothes and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low, but as he passed beneath her window, their eyes met for an instant. His face was weathered by sun and loss marked by the kind of premature lines that came from carrying burdens too heavy for one man's shoulders. Something in his expression was different from the others. No mockery, no pity, just a recognition that made Clara's chest tighten with unexpected emotion. Then he was gone, disappearing into the maze of alleys that connected Ember Creek's scattered buildings like veins in a dying body. Outside, coyotes began their nightly chorus in the hills, their voices rising and falling like warnings whispered in an ancient language. Clara pulled Ruth's thin blanket around her shoulders and tried not to think about the $3 in her pocket or the 1,000 miles between her and anywhere else she might belong. In the morning, she would have to begin the hardest fight of her life, the fight to prove she deserved to exist in a world that had already judged her unworthy. Clara woke to the drumming of rain on the stable roof, the first precipitation she'd witnessed since arriving in this sun-baked purgatory. Through the loft window, she watched water pool in the street's wheel ruts, creating brief mirrors that would be baked to cracked earth by noon. Dawn was still hours away, but she could hear Ruth moving in the kitchen, beginning the endless work that kept frontier establishments alive. She dressed quickly in her second dress, practical gray cotton that disguised stains and wouldn't show the wear of hard labor. Climbing down from the loft, she found a basin of wash water waiting by the stable door, along with a thick wool coat that clearly belonged to a man and a cloth bundle that carried the warm scent of fresh bread and bacon. Clara examined the coat with a seamstress's eye for detail. Well made but worn, it showed careful mending along one sleeve, tiny, precise stitches that spoke of someone who understood the value of preserving what couldn't be easily replaced. The bread was still warm, the bacon crisp, with just enough salt to make her mouth water after days of sparse eating. Morning. The voice startled her. The tall man from the previous evening stood in the stable doorway, rain dripping from his hat brim like a curtain. Up close, she could see he was younger than the lines on his face suggested, perhaps mid-30s, but his eyes carried the weight of someone who'd buried too many hopes. "I thank you for the coat," Clara said, holding up the garment that would mean the difference between warmth and misery in the days ahead. "And the food. I'll find a way to repay you." He shook his head with the decisiveness of a man uncomfortable with gratitude. "Name's Silas Boone. Run a small spread about 2 miles east of town. Ruth mentioned you might be looking for work." Clara studied his face, searching for the mockery or charity she'd learned to expect, but found neither. "I can sew, but I don't know much about ranch work. Can you follow directions, work in weather that'd make a preacher curse?" When she nodded, he continued, "Pays $2 a week, plus meals when you're working. Fair warning, it ain't easy money." $2 would stretch her savings and buy time to find something more permanent. More importantly, it would give her a reason to exist in Ember Creek beyond Ruth's charity. "When do I start?" "Now, if you can handle it. Storm's moving through and I need to check the stock before it gets worse." He gestured toward a saddled mare tied outside. "You ever ride?" Clara had ridden perhaps a dozen times in her life, all on gentle farm horses back in Illinois. But desperation was a powerful teacher, and pride a luxury she couldn't afford. "I'll manage." They rode east through the strengthening storm, following a track that wound between sagebrush and weathered stone formations that looked like ancient monuments to forgotten gods. Silas rode ahead, occasionally glancing back to ensure Clara was managing, but offering no unnecessary conversation. The horse beneath her, a steady mare named Patience, seemed to sense her inexperience and maintained an easy gait despite the worsening weather. The Boone Ranch emerged from the rain-gray landscape like a promise of human persistence in hostile country. A cluster of buildings sheltered by cottonwoods that must have taken years to establish the main house was modest but solid, with a covered porch and windows that gleamed despite the storm. Outbuildings included a substantial barn chicken coop and what appeared to be a workshop. As they approached, a small figure darted from the house, a boy of perhaps 8 years, dark-haired and quick, despite a pronounced limp in his left leg. His face lit up as he reached for the horse's reins. Uncle Silas, I was watching for you." The boy's voice carried pure joy, untainted by the suspicion that seemed to poison most interactions in Ember Creek. "Mrs. Patterson brought biscuits, and I helped with the chickens, just like you showed me." Silas's entire demeanor softened as he dismounted, the careful guardedness dropping away to reveal genuine affection. "Jacob, this is Miss Fields. She's going to help us with some work around the place." The boy's curious gaze fixed on Clara with the frank interest children brought to new experiences. Unlike the adults in town, he showed no judgment about her appearance, only natural curiosity about someone who might become part of his small world. "Are you the lady from the stagecoach?" Jacob asked with the directness that made adults uncomfortable. "Tommy Morrison said Sheriff Brand was awful mean to you in front of everybody." "Jacob," Silas's voice carried gentle warning. "It's all right," Clara said, climbing down with more grace than she'd expected from her aching muscles. "Yes, I'm that lady. And yes, the sheriff was unkind." Jacob considered this with the seriousness children brought to adult mysteries. Sheriff Brand's mean to lots of folks. He made Mrs. Henderson cry last month when her husband died, and she couldn't pay taxes right away. Made her sell their milk cow. Silas took the horse's reins, but Clara caught the tightening around his eyes. "Why don't you show Miss Fields the workshop while I tend to these animals? She might have ideas about fixing that saddle blanket that's been giving us trouble." The workshop was a revelation that spoke of skill, patience, and the kind of detailed attention Clara recognized in her own needlework. Shelves lined with carefully organized tools, bolts of fabric in various stages of use, leather goods awaiting repair, and a workbench that showed years of productive labor. Clara ran her fingers over a half-finished bridle, noting the precise stitching and careful attention to both function and appearance. "Uncle Silas makes everything we need," Jacob explained with obvious pride. "He fixed my leg brace when it broke, and he sewed up Patience's cut from barbed wire so neat you can barely see the scar." Clara looked more closely at the boy's leg and saw the metal brace that helped support his foot. Like everything else here, it was well maintained and carefully fitted to provide maximum benefit without unnecessary discomfort. "What happened?" she asked gently. Jacob's smile faded slightly. "Accident when I was little. Ma and Pa died in the same fire, so Uncle Silas takes care of me now." He straightened his shoulders with visible effort. "He says I'm perfect just the way I am, but some folks in town think different." Clara knelt to Jacob's level, meeting his eyes with the same directness he'd shown her. "Some people think being different makes you less than others. They're wrong. Being different just means you see the world from your own special place, and that's worth more than fitting in with people who can't understand." "You really think so?" Jacob's voice was small but hopeful. "I know so. I've been different my whole life, too big, too poor, too stubborn for most people's comfort. But those differences made me strong in ways that matter more than what shows on the outside." When Silas returned from the barn, he found Clara and Jacob working together to sort leather scraps by size and quality. The boy chattering enthusiastically about his plans to make a belt, while Clara offered suggestions about stitching techniques and finishing methods. "Storm's getting worse," Silas observed, glancing toward the windows that rattled under wind-driven rain. "Road back to town might wash out before evening. You're welcome to stay for supper and wait it out." Clara looked toward the windows, where rain lashed the glass with increasing fury. The practical part of her mind calculated distances and dangers, but another part, a part that had been dormant too long, recognized the warmth in this house. The way Jacob looked at his uncle with absolute trust, the careful way Silas maintained everything from fence posts to the boy's mobility. "I'd be grateful for the shelter," she said. The woman who emerged from the kitchen, as if summoned by the prospect of company, was clearly accustomed to managing both household and ranch responsibilities. Gray-haired and competent, she wore a flour-dusted apron over practical brown cotton and moved with the efficiency of someone who'd learned to accomplish much with limited resources. "This is Mrs. Patterson," Silas explained. "She helps with Jacob and the cooking most days. Couldn't manage without her." Mrs. Patterson studied Clara with the same frank assessment Ruth had employed, but her conclusion seemed more favorable. "Heard about your troubles in town. That Brand's got a black heart and no sense whatsoever. Any woman brave enough to come out here alone deserves better than what you got." The supper was simple, but abundant beef stew, thick with vegetables, fresh bread, and apple preserves that Mrs. Patterson had clearly brought from her own stores. Jacob maintained a steady stream of conversation, asking Clara about St. Louis factories, whether she'd ever seen a real train wreck, and if people back east really wore different clothes every single day. But Clara found herself watching Silas, the way he listened to Jacob's stories with complete attention, how he cut the boy's meat without making it seem childish, the gentle corrections he offered about table manners. This was a man who'd taken on unexpected responsibility and embraced it with the kind of wholehearted commitment that spoke of genuine love rather than mere duty. Uncle Silas was going to marry Miss Sarah Henderson. Jacob announced between bites of stew, apparently unaware of the delicate nature of the subject. But she got scared of living out here and went back east to marry a bank clerk. "Right, Uncle Silas?" Mrs. Patterson shot the boy a warning look, but Silas merely nodded with the philosophical acceptance that marked frontier survivors. Sometimes people need different things from life. No shame in knowing what you can and can't handle. I think she was silly. Jacob declared with the absolute certainty of childhood. "This is the best place in the whole world." Clara looked around the warm kitchen at the boy's bright face, at Silas's quiet strength, at the evidence of lives built through persistence and mutual care, and thought maybe Jacob wasn't entirely wrong. But she also thought about Sarah Henderson, who'd had the luxury of choice, the option of walking away when frontier life proved harder than expected. Clara Fields had no such luxury. This harsh country was her only option now, and she'd have to find a way not just to survive it, but to make it home. Outside, the storm raged through the night as if the desert itself was testing her resolve for the battles ahead. The storm had passed by morning, leaving Ember Creek washed clean, but no more welcoming than before. Clara walked back to town with Silas and Jacob as the sun painted the eastern mountains gold and promised another day of brutal heat. The borrowed coat still hung around her shoulders. Silas had insisted she keep it until she could afford something warmer. "Remember what we talked about," Clara said to Jacob as they approached the schoolhouse where other children were already gathering. "Being different isn't being less." The boy straightened his shoulders, adjusting his leg brace with practiced ease. "I'll remember. Will you come back to help Uncle Silas?" "If he needs the help," Clara replied, glancing at Silas. His nod was subtle but definite. "Course we need the help," Jacob said with 8-year-old logic. "Uncle Silas says a ranch is like a big family, and families work better when there's more people to share the load." Clara parted ways with them at the main street, making her way back to Ruth's Inn. Through streets that buzzed with morning activity. She'd taken only a few steps when she realized conversations were stopping as she passed voices dropping to whispers that followed in her wake like the tail of a comet. "Got some nerve still hanging around after what happened. Marma probably stole that coat right off someone's back. Sheriff Brand says she's got warrants back east for confidence schemes." Clara's steps faltered as the implications hit home. She hadn't stolen anything in her life, and there were certainly no warrants for her arrest anywhere. But in a small town where rumor traveled faster than truth, facts mattered less than what people wanted to believe. Ruth met her at the inn's back door, her expression grim as a thundercloud. "Brand's been busy since yesterday evening. Spreading stories about you being some kind of professional swindler, maybe worse." She gestured Clara inside, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. "Got folks worked up like hornets in a disturbed nest." "What kind of stories?" "Claims you probably lied about everything in those letters you wrote." Says he's got telegraph contacts checking your background back east, and they're finding all sorts of trouble following in your wake. Ruth's voice was tight with barely controlled anger. Course he ain't shown anybody these supposed telegrams, but that don't matter to people who want to believe the worst. Clara sank into a kitchen chair, feeling the weight of exhaustion and despair settling on her shoulders like lead blankets. Why is he doing this? He already humiliated me in front of half the town. Isn't that enough? Brand don't like being made to look foolish, even when he does it to himself. In his mind, your very existence here is an insult to his judgment. Ruth began chopping vegetables with more force than strictly necessary. Man's got a cruel streak wider than the Rio Grande. Always has, but being sheriff gives him license to indulge it. Can I still work here? I don't want to bring you more trouble. Ruth's knife stilled on the cutting board. You can work here long as I own this place and draw breath. But I got to warn you, Brand's got influence with certain folks. He's already been to see Judge Morrison about having you arrested as a vagrant. The words hit Clara like ice water thrown in her face. Vagrancy laws in the territories were harsh and often selectively enforced and designed to give sheriffs tools for removing undesirable elements. A person without visible means of support could be arrested, fined heavily, or sentenced to work on public projects, effectively making them slaves of the state until their debt was paid. How long do I have? Judge Morrison's a fair man, but he's also careful about procedure. He won't move against you without evidence, but if Brand keeps stirring up trouble and can point to actual crimes... Ruth trailed off, but the implication was clear enough. Clara spent the morning helping with laundry, trying to ignore the stares and whispers from people passing the inn's windows. Ruth's few guests, traveling salesmen and miners heading to claims in the hills, treated her with polite indifference. But she could feel the weight of the town's suspicion growing heavier with each passing hour. Around noon, she was hanging sheets on the line behind the inn, when a delegation of women approached with the measured precision of a military formation. Led by Mrs. Garrett, the banker's wife, they wore their Sunday dresses despite the weekday, and carried themselves with the self-righteousness of people convinced of their own moral superiority. Miss Fields. Mrs. Garrett's voice could have frozen July. We represent the Ember Creek Ladies' Improvement Society. Clara continued hanging laundry, but her hands trembled slightly as she pinned a pillowcase to the line. These women had the power to make her life in Ember Creek impossible, and they knew it. Ladies, we understand you've been staying here since Sheriff Brand discovered your deception. Mrs. Garrett pronounced the word deception like it tasted of poison. We want you to understand that decent people have serious concerns about your continued presence in our community. What concerns might those be? Clara asked, though she dreaded the answer. Single women of questionable character attract the wrong sort of attention, declared Mrs. Henderson, whose daughter Sarah had abandoned Silas Boone for the safety of Eastern civilization. Young men get ideas, decent families are disrupted, moral standards decline. I work honest labor for my keep and mind my own business. Clara said quietly, forcing her voice to remain level despite the anger building in her chest. Work. Mrs. Garrett's laugh was sharp as broken glass. We know you've been spending time at the Boone Ranch. That poor man has troubles enough without you taking advantage of his charitable nature. Heat flooded Clara's face, but she kept her voice steady. I mend fences and help with chores. Nothing improper has occurred. Nothing improper yet, Mrs. Henderson added with meaningful emphasis. But we know how these situations develop. A woman like yourself, alone and desperate, might resort to unsavory methods to secure her position. The implication hung in the desert air like smoke from a grass fire. Clara's hands stilled on the clothesline as fury built in her chest, not the hot rage that burned bright and faded quickly, but the cold anger that could sustain itself for years and drive people to accomplish impossible things. A woman like myself, Clara turned to face them fully, her voice dropping to a deadly quiet that made Mrs. Garrett step backward. "You mean a woman who works for honest wages, who doesn't expect others to solve her problems, who treats children with kindness and doesn't judge people by their dress size or bank account?" Mrs. Garrett's face flushed dark red. "Don't you dare take that tone with decent women, you... Go ahead," Clara said, stepping closer. "Say what you really think. Call me fat, call me desperate, call me whatever makes you feel superior. But don't pretend this is about morality or community standards. This is about needing someone to look down on so you can feel better about your own small lives. How dare you speak to us that way?" Mrs. Henderson gasped. "I dare because I've got nothing left to lose. You want to judge me? Fine. Judge me by my actions instead of my appearance. I've never stolen, never lied about who I am, never destroyed someone's reputation for sport, never hurt a child. Can all of you say the same?" The women retreated in a flutter of skirts and wounded dignity, their whispered conversations promising swift retaliation for Clara's audacity. But Clara knew she'd won nothing except the certainty of their permanent enmity. She'd learned long ago that standing up to bullies felt righteous in the moment, but often made survival harder in the long run. Ruth appeared at the back door, having heard the entire confrontation through the thin walls. "Well, that tears it. Those hens will have half the town convinced you're a scarlet woman before supper time. Maybe I should leave," Clara said quietly, looking toward the mountains that ringed Ember Creek like the walls of a prison. "Find another town, start over somewhere else. With what money besides running just proves their point and lets them win completely." Ruth's expression was fierce with protective anger. "You got more backbone than the lot of them combined. Don't let a bunch of scared women drive you off before you've had a fair chance." But as Clara watched the delegation hurry away, no doubt planning their next assault on her reputation, she wondered how long backbone would sustain her against an entire community's worth of spite and suspicion. That afternoon brought a series of small humiliations that felt like drops of water wearing away stone. The general store owner claimed to be out of thread when Clara needed supplies for her sewing. The blacksmith discovered he was too busy to reshoe Ruth's horse, though his forge sat cold and unused. Even the minister's wife, who'd always nodded politely when their paths crossed, now crossed the street to avoid any possibility of acknowledgement. The message was clear: Ember Creek was closing ranks against her one person at a time, until she'd be left with nothing but Ruth's charity and her own dwindling resources. But as she walked back to the inn through the afternoon heat, Clara noticed something else. A few faces that didn't turn away in disgust, a few nods that seemed sympathetic rather than condemning. Not everyone in town was willing to follow Marcus Brand's lead, even if they weren't brave enough to openly oppose him. It wasn't much, but it was something. And Clara Fields had built entire futures on less promising foundations before. The pattern established itself over the following weeks, like a noose tightening one loop at a time. Each morning brought new restrictions, new forms of subtle persecution orchestrated by Sheriff Brand and enthusiastically enforced by his growing circle of supporters. The blacksmith continued to refuse work on Ruth's equipment, forcing costly trips to neighboring towns for essential services. The general store remained mysteriously empty of supplies whenever Clara appeared. Children threw rocks at the inn's windows, then scattered like startled birds when Ruth emerged to scold them. But the thefts were the worst part, a campaign of carefully orchestrated crime designed to frame Clara as the obvious culprit. It started with small things: chickens disappearing from backyard coops, tools vanishing from work sites, small amounts of money missing from the church collection box. Each incident was discovered with great public fanfare, and each time whispers pointed toward the stranger who'd brought nothing but trouble to their peaceful community. A mighty convenient timing, Brand observed loudly outside the saloon when Mrs. Garrett's prize rooster went missing. These problems started the very day that woman stepped off the stagecoach. Clara heard about each accusation through Ruth, who made no secret of her disgust with the town's willingness to abandon logic in favor of convenient scapegoating. Half these fools wouldn't recognize evidence if it danced naked in front of them. She fumed after the latest incident, a missing saddle from the livery stable. You were sitting right here in my kitchen all evening when that saddle disappeared. But do they care about facts when lies are so much more satisfying? The answer was obviously no. Facts had become inconvenient obstacles to a narrative that served Brand's purposes perfectly. By casting Clara as a criminal, he deflected attention from his own failings and gave the town's accumulated frustrations a target that couldn't fight back effectively. Clara continued working at Silas's ranch, finding refuge in physical labor and the quiet companionship of Jacob. The boy seemed immune to the town's hysteria, chattering cheerfully about his lessons and his ambitious plans to build a treehouse in the cottonwoods that would serve as both fortress and observation post. "Miss Fields," he said one afternoon as they worked together to replace a section of storm-damaged fencing. "Why don't people in town like you? You're nice, and you help everybody, and you never say mean things about anybody." Clara paused in her hammering, considering how to explain adult cruelty to a child who'd seen enough hardship already. Sometimes when people are frightened or unhappy, it's easier to blame someone else than to fix their real problems. "But you haven't done anything wrong." "No, I haven't. But the truth doesn't always matter when people are looking for someone to punish for their troubles." Jacob considered this with the serious expression he brought to difficult concepts. "Uncle Silas says fear makes smart people act stupid, and stupid people act dangerous. Your uncle is a wise man. Are you afraid of them?" Clara looked across the desert landscape, endless miles of sagebrush and stone, broken only by the jagged mountains that seemed to fence them all into this isolated valley, where petty tyrants could flourish unchecked. Sometimes. But being afraid and being beaten are different things. That evening, as Clara prepared to return to town, Silas appeared with a wrapped bundle that felt suspiciously heavy. "Supplies," he said, simply meeting her questioning look with steady eyes. "Thread fabric, some food items Ruth mentioned you'd been having trouble obtaining in town." Clara unwrapped the bundle to find everything she'd been unable to purchase over the past weeks. Quality thread in multiple colors, sturdy cotton fabric, sharp needles, and even some preserved fruit that must have come from Mrs. Patterson's carefully managed stores. "I can't pay you for all this. Consider it advance payment for the work you're doing. Those fences would have taken me twice as long to repair working alone, and Jacob's happier than he's been since." Silas paused and then continued more quietly. "Since his parents died. That's worth more than money. It was a kind fiction designed to preserve Clara's dignity, and they both knew it. She was learning ranch work quickly, but she was still more burden than help in many tasks. Silas was paying her generously for something that went beyond mere labor, for the feminine influence Jacob needed for adult conversation that didn't revolve around livestock and weather, for the simple pleasure of sharing meals with someone who understood that survival required more than just keeping breath in your body. But Clara also sensed something deeper in Silas's quiet support. When he looked at her, she saw none of the pity or judgment that marked other faces in town. Instead, she saw recognition, the acknowledgement of someone who understood what it meant to be marked by difference, to carry burdens others couldn't see, to keep going, despite the world's indifference. The crisis escalated on a Tuesday morning when Mrs. Morrison, the judge's wife, discovered her jewelry box had been rifled during the night. A pearl brooch and matching earrings were missing, along with a small amount of cash she'd kept hidden beneath a false bottom for emergencies. By noon, the entire town buzzed with outrage that went beyond anything Clara had witnessed. This theft represented a violation of the community's most respected family. Judge Morrison was not only the law's representative, but also one of the few educated men in Ember Creek. His wife's jewelry represented culture and refinement in a place where both were as rare as honest politicians. Sheriff Brand wasted no time fanning the flames of public anger. He organized a town meeting for that evening, ostensibly to discuss security measures, but clearly intended as a public trial of Clara's reputation and character. "Folks are scared," Ruth reported after returning from an copy saved to notion, tai sao lai dung toi, xin loi vi jan dung jot, got ku ven hu ku gioi, hanjo dai trong mot fan hoi dui nhat, tui se tiep tu kuan theng kao chuyen tu cho dung lai. "Folks are scared," Ruth reported after returning from an expedition to gather supplies and information. "Garrett's talking about hiring armed guards for his bank. Mrs. Henderson's convinced this thief is going to murder them all in their beds for whatever trinkets they might have." What does Judge Morrison say about all this? That's the strange part. He's keeping unusually quiet, letting Brand run the show instead of taking charge like he normally would. Not like him to step back from community leadership when there's real trouble brewing. That evening, the schoolhouse filled beyond capacity with people who'd traveled from distant ranches and mining claims to witness what everyone expected to be Clara's public condemnation. Brand took the makeshift podium with the confidence of a man who'd carefully orchestrated every detail of what was to come. He spoke eloquently about the crime wave plaguing their peaceful community, about the need to protect decent families from predators who preyed on Christian hospitality and frontier charity. His words painted Clara as a calculating criminal who'd chosen Ember Creek specifically because it appeared vulnerable to exploitation. "Now I ain't one to point fingers without solid proof," he said with false reasonableness that fooled no one who knew him. "But we got to face hard facts here. These thefts started the very day a certain person arrived in our town under false pretenses. Someone who's been living off charity while honest folks work for their daily bread." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the packed room. Clara sat in the back with Ruth, feeling the weight of hostile stares like physical blows. A few faces remained studiously neutral. Silas had come, despite the late hours, sitting with Jacob near the door. But the vast majority clearly favored Brand's interpretation of events. "I say it's time for formal action." Brand continued building toward his predetermined conclusion. "Time to search the premises where this person's been staying, examine her possessions, ask some hard questions about where she really came from and what she might be running from." Mrs. Garrett stood to voice enthusiastic support for immediate action. Mrs. Henderson seconded the motion with righteous fervor. Other voices joined the growing chorus, calling for Clara's arrest and removal before more damage could be done to their community. Then Judge Morrison rose from his seat near the front, and the room fell silent with surprise. "Sheriff Brand," he said in the quiet voice that had commanded respect in courtrooms across 3 territories. "You're talking about searching private property without a warrant based on nothing but speculation and circumstantial timing." Brand's confidence flickered like a candle in wind. "Judge, with all due respect, we got a clear pattern here. We have a series of thefts, yes. We also have a community that's chosen to focus its suspicions on the most convenient target rather than conducting a proper investigation." Morrison's voice carried the authority of education and experience that even Brand couldn't easily dismiss. "Has anyone actually witnessed Miss Fields commit a crime? Has any physical evidence linked her to these thefts?" The uncomfortable silence stretched like a held breath. Brand's face flushed with anger at having his authority challenged in public, especially by someone whose respect he needed to maintain his position. Sometimes a man's got to act on instinct when lives and property are at stake. Brand said, his voice taking on a dangerous edge. "Sometimes waiting for fancy legal procedures gets innocent people hurt. And sometimes a man's instinct is clouded by personal grievances and poor judgment." Morrison replied with devastating calm. "I suggest we table this discussion until actual evidence emerges, rather than rushing to judgment based on fear and speculation." The crowd grumbled with frustrated disappointment. But Morrison's intervention had effectively ended the meeting. People filed out in small groups, their voices carrying complaints about legal technicalities and judicial cowardice that prevented swift justice. Clara approached the judge as the schoolhouse emptied her throat tight with gratitude. "Thank you for standing up for proper procedure." Morrison studied her with intelligent gray eyes that seemed to see more than most people's. "I believe in evidence and due process, Miss Fields. But I'd be very careful if I were you. Brand doesn't handle public embarrassment well, and he's got a long memory for perceived slights." As Clara and Ruth walked back to the inn, through streets that seemed to whisper with residual hostility, Clara realized the judge's intervention had bought her time, but not safety. Brand would be more determined than ever to prove her guilt, and he'd be more careful about gathering evidence that couldn't be dismissed by legal technicalities. The real game was just beginning, and the stakes kept getting higher. That night, lying in her hayloft bed while desert wind rattled the stable walls, Clara heard sounds outside that made her blood run cold. Footsteps in the alley, whispered conversations, the creak of wooden boards as someone moved carefully around the inn's perimeter. She pressed her face to the small window, but saw only shadows and the occasional glint of moonlight on metal. Someone was watching, planning, waiting for the right moment to strike. Clara pulled the borrowed coat closer around her shoulders and tried to convince herself that morning would bring better news. But deep in her heart, she knew the town's patience was nearly exhausted, and when it finally snapped completely, she'd need more than Judge Morrison's legal principles to survive what came next. 3 days after the town meeting, Clara made a discovery that changed everything she thought she knew about her situation in Ember Creek. She was mending a coat. Ruth had brought her a woman's garment well made, but showing years of careful wear. The owner had requested new buttons and repairs to a torn pocket, paying in advance, with the kind of quiet courtesy that had become increasingly rare in Clara's interactions with townspeople. As she worked to reattach the pocket lining, her fingers found something hard, lodged deep in the seam, a small object that had apparently worked its way into the fabric during months or years of regular wear. Clara worked it free carefully, expecting to find a lost button or perhaps a forgotten coin. Instead, she found herself staring at a delicate silver brooch set with small pearls, the exact piece that had been stolen from Mrs. Morrison's jewelry box. Clara's hands trembled as she examined the stolen property. The craftsmanship was distinctive, the pearls arranged in a floral pattern that had been described in precise detail during the town meeting. There could be no mistake about what she was holding or where it had come from. But how had it gotten into the coat's seam? Clara tried to remember who had brought the garment for repair, but Ruth had simply said, "Mrs. Patterson asked me to give this to you." Clara had assumed it belonged to one of Mrs. Patterson's friends or neighbors who couldn't afford regular seamstress prices. Her mind raced through possibilities, each more troubling than the last. The brooch could have been deliberately placed in the coat to incriminate her when it was inevitably discovered. But the way it was lodged in the seam suggested it had been there for considerable time, worked into the fabric through normal movement and wear. Clara rewrapped the brooch carefully and sat back, her thoughts churning like water in a flash flood. She needed to understand how this piece had ended up in the coat before deciding what to do with the knowledge. The logical step was to ask Ruth about the garment's owner, but something made her hesitate, an instinct developed through years of surviving in hostile environments. Instead, Clara climbed down from the loft and made her way to the kitchen where Ruth was preparing the evening meal for her few remaining guests. "The coat you brought me for repair," Clara said carefully, watching Ruth's expression. "Where exactly did it come from?" Ruth glanced up from her cooking, noting something in Clara's tone that sharpened her attention. "Mrs. Patterson brought it by this morning. Said it belonged to someone who needed the work done but couldn't afford regular prices." She paused, studying Clara's face. "Why, something wrong with it." "Who's the usual seamstress in town?" "Mrs. Brand. Sheriff's wife does most of the fine sewing work around here." Ruth's eyes narrowed with growing concern. "Clara, what's going on? You look like you've seen a ghost." Before Clara could answer, the kitchen door burst open with enough force to rattle the windows. Mrs. Patterson entered in a state of obvious agitation, her usually neat appearance disheveled, and her face flushed with exertion or emotion. "Ruth, I need to speak with Miss Fields immediately." Her voice carried an urgency that made both women turn toward her with alarm. "It's about that coat I brought for repair." Clara felt her heartbeat accelerate like a runaway horse. "What about it?" Mrs. Patterson glanced around nervously, then focused on Clara with something approaching desperation. "I need it back. Right now, before anyone knows it was here. May I ask why the sudden change?" Clara pressed gently, though her mind was already forming terrible conclusions. Mrs. Patterson's composure crumbled like a dam under flood pressure. "I shouldn't have brought it here in the first place. I was trying to help, but I've made everything so much worse." Ruth moved to the older woman's side, guiding her to a chair with practiced gentleness. "Sit down, Mabel. Tell us what's wrong." "It's Mrs. Brand's coat," Mrs. Patterson whispered, as if the walls themselves might be listening. "She asked me to bring it for repair because she couldn't be seen helping you directly, Miss Fields. Said she knew you needed the work, but couldn't risk her husband's anger if he found out." Clara's mind reeled with the implications. She'd been mending the sheriff's wife's coat and had found stolen property hidden in its seam. The possibilities were staggering and terrifying in equal measure. "Mrs. Patterson," Clara said slowly, fighting to keep her voice steady. "How long has Mrs. Brand owned this particular coat?" "Years and years. It was her mother's before that came with her when she married the sheriff. She wears it most evenings when she walks to her sister's house or goes to church meetings." Clara pulled the wrapped brooch from her pocket, her hands shaking slightly as she revealed the stolen jewelry. When Mrs. Patterson saw it, she gasped and pressed her hand to her mouth in shock. "Sweet Mother of God," she breathed. "How did that get in there?" "That's what we need to figure out," Clara said. "But first, I need to know, has Mrs. Brand been wearing this coat regularly, even recently?" Mrs. Patterson nodded slowly, her face pale with dawning comprehension. "She wears it almost every evening. Has for months, maybe longer." The pieces began falling into place in Clara's mind like dominoes in a carefully constructed line. If the brooch had worked its way into the coat's seam through normal wear, that suggested Mrs. Brand had been carrying it regularly, perhaps in the same pocket that had needed repair. "There's something else," Mrs. Patterson said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mrs. Brand's been different lately. Nervous, jumpy, looking over her shoulder like she expects trouble. When she asked me to bring the coat here, she made me promise not to mention it to anyone, especially not the sheriff." Ruth's expression had grown progressively grimmer as the conversation developed. Or maybe she was worried about what Clara might find when she started working on it. Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert evening. "How long has Mrs. Brand been having money troubles?" "Money troubles?" Mrs. Patterson looked confused by the sudden change of direction. "The sheriff's salary can't be substantial," Clara explained, thinking aloud. "But Mrs. Brand wears nice dresses, has jewelry, seems to live comfortably by frontier standards. Where does the extra money come from?" Mrs. Patterson's face went white as the implication sank home like a blade between ribs. You think she's been stealing? That she's been taking things and letting you get blamed for it?" "I think someone has been very carefully orchestrating a campaign to frame me for crimes I didn't commit." Clara said, her voice steady despite the emotions churning in her chest. Relief that she might finally have proof of her innocence warred with anger at the systematic persecution she'd endured. "The question is what we do with this knowledge." Ruth's laugh was bitter as desert alkali. "We take it straight to Judge Morrison and let him sort it out. Clear your name once and for all." But Clara had learned to be suspicious of simple solutions, especially when they involved trusting institutions that had already failed her. Mrs. Brand was the sheriff's wife. Even with evidence, it would be Clara's word against that of the town's most powerful family. And if Brand was involved in his wife's activities, or even just willing to protect her, Clara could easily find herself accused of planting evidence. "We need more proof," she said finally. "One piece of jewelry could be explained away. Maybe I planted it. Maybe Mrs. Brand lost it innocently, and it fell into her coat pocket during some social gathering. We need to catch her in the act, or find evidence that can't be dismissed or explained away." "That's dangerous," Ruth warned. "If Brand suspects you're onto his wife's activities, he already suspects me of everything else imaginable. At least now I know I'm not fighting shadows and rumors." Clara rewrapped the brooch carefully, her mind already working through possibilities and dangers. "But we need to be smart about this. One mistake and I'll end up in jail or worse." Mrs. Patterson was wringing her hands with nervous energy. "What about the coat? Should I take it back to Mrs. Brand if she realizes it's been searched thoroughly?" "You return it exactly as planned," Clara said firmly. "With all repairs completed professionally. Act natural, make normal conversation. If she asks any specific questions about the work I did, tell her it was routine mending and nothing more. And the brooch." Clara looked at the small wrapped bundle that represented both her salvation and potentially her death warrant. "The brooch stays with me until I figure out how to use it without getting myself killed in the process." After Mrs. Patterson left with the repaired coat, Clara and Ruth sat in the kitchen, both lost in thought, as the implications of their discovery settled like dust after a windstorm. "Changes everything, doesn't it?" Ruth said finally. "Everything," Clara agreed. "The question is whether I'll live long enough to prove it." Outside, the wind picked up with the promise of another storm, rattling windows and carrying the scent of distant rain. Clara thought about Mrs. Brand walking through town in her mother's coat, carrying stolen goods, while an innocent woman took the blame for her crimes. The anger that had been building in Clara's chest for weeks finally found its proper target. She'd been fighting the wrong battle, defending herself against false accusations, while the real criminal watched safely from the sidelines. Now she knew the truth. The question was whether she could expose it before Brand and his supporters decided that legal niceties were luxuries they could no longer afford. As if summoned by her dark thoughts, the sound of boots on the wooden walkway outside made both women freeze. Heavy, deliberate steps approached the kitchen door, the kind of steps that belonged to a man accustomed to being feared. Sheriff Brand's voice carried through the thin walls with unmistakable menace. "Ruth Garrison, I need to speak with you about your guest. Official business that won't wait for morning." Clara and Ruth exchanged glances as the footsteps grew closer. The brooch felt like it was burning through Clara's pocket, and she realized with crystalline clarity that the real game was about to begin. Sheriff Brand entered the kitchen without waiting for permission, his hand resting casually on his gun belt in a gesture designed to remind everyone present who held ultimate authority. Behind him came two men, Clara recognized as his regular drinking companions, Jake Morrison, no relation to the judge, and Pete Hendricks, both known throughout Ember Creek for their quick tempers and flexible relationship with legal niceties. "Evening, ladies," Brand said with a kind of false politeness that made Clara's skin crawl. "Sorry to disturb your domestic tranquility, but we've got ourselves a situation that requires immediate attention." Ruth remained seated, her expression carefully neutral, despite the obvious threat. "What kind of situation would that be, Sheriff?" "The kind where decent citizens are getting tired of waiting for legal procedures that seem designed to protect criminals rather than honest folks." Brand's pale eyes fixed on Clara with predatory intensity. "Seems some people are starting to take matters into their own hands, and I'm not sure I can guarantee anyone's safety much longer." Clara felt the stolen brooch's weight in her pocket like a burning coal, but kept her voice steady. "What does that have to do with me?" Brand's smile was cruel as a winter wind. "Everything, darling. See, we had another theft today. Money from the church poor box that Father Miguel was saving to buy winter coats for orphan children. Real heartless crime, stealing from folks who got nothing to begin with." "I was here all day," Clara said quietly. Ruth can confirm that. Ruth can say whatever she wants, but friends sometimes lie for friends, especially when they're both living on the edge of respectability. Brand stepped closer, his boots loud on the wooden floor. Besides, alibis don't mean much when you're dealing with someone clever enough to have accomplices. Ruth stood slowly, her face flushing with anger that years of frontier hardship had taught her to control. Marcus Brand, you know perfectly well. I know a lot of things, Ruth, including the fact that harboring a known criminal makes you an accessory after the fact. Brand's voice hardened with unmistakable threat. That's a serious charge in territorial law. Could lose your business license, maybe face jail time yourself. The implication hung in the air like gun smoke. Clara realized with sick certainty that Brand was escalating beyond whispers and social pressure to direct action. The brooch in her pocket proved Mrs. Brand's guilt, but it wouldn't matter if Clara was arrested or killed before she could reveal it. What exactly do you want, Brand? Ruth's voice was steady despite the obvious danger. Simple solution to a complex problem. Miss Fields packs her belongings and leaves town on tomorrow's noon stage. Problem solved, everyone goes back to their normal lives. And if I refuse? Clara asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Brand's companion shifted slightly hands, moving closer to their weapons, in a gesture too subtle to be called threatening, but too obvious to be accidental. The message was clear, this wasn't really a negotiation. Well now, Brand drawled with theatrical regret. That wouldn't be very smart thinking. See, folks in town are getting mighty worked up about these thefts. They might do something rash if they thought you were planning to stick around indefinitely and keep stealing from honest families. Clara thought about the mob that could easily be assembled angry men who'd been primed with weeks of suspicion and fear, fueled by alcohol and Brand's inflammatory rhetoric. Lynch law was still common enough in the territories, and sheriffs who wanted to look the other way could always claim they'd been overwhelmed by righteous citizens seeking justice. I need time to consider your suggestion, Clara said carefully. Time's a luxury you can't afford. Brand pulled out his pocket watch with theatrical precision, making sure everyone could see the performance. It's 8:30 now. You got until midnight to make your decision. After that, I can't guarantee what might happen to people who overstay their welcome. He turned toward the door and then paused as if struck by an afterthought that fooled no one present. Oh, and Ruth, if you're thinking about hiding her somewhere or helping her run off into the desert, well, that would make you part of the problem. And problems have a way of spreading to other folks who might have helped along the way. The implicit threat to Mrs. Patterson and anyone else who'd shown Clara kindness was unmistakable. Brand was systematically eliminating her support network, isolating her completely, before moving in for whatever final solution he had planned. After the men left, Clara and Ruth sat in stunned silence, the kitchen feeling smaller somehow, as if the walls were closing in like a trap. He's not bluffing about the mob, Ruth said finally. Brand's got enough followers who'd ride with him into hell if he asked pretty enough. And with the mood in town running against you? Clara nodded, her mind racing through impossible options. She could run, take what little money she had, and disappear into the desert, hoping to reach another town before Brand's influence caught up with her. But running would confirm her guilt in everyone's minds, and she'd spend the rest of her life looking over her shoulder for frontier justice. Or she could stay and fight with the evidence she'd discovered. But one brooch wasn't enough to overturn weeks of carefully constructed lies, especially when the accused was the sheriff's wife, and the accuser was a friendless stranger. There's a third option, Clara said slowly, the words tasting like poison even as she spoke them. What? I could confess to the thefts. Tell Brand I'll leave town quietly and never return if he drops any charges against people who helped me. Ruth's face went white as bleached bone. That's suicide, Clara. You'd be admitting to crimes you never committed. But it would end this nightmare. You'd be safe, Mrs. Patterson would be safe. Even Silas and Jacob would be protected from any backlash. And you'd be branded a criminal for the rest of your days, assuming Brand lets you live long enough to have the rest of your days. Clara touched the brooch through her pocket, feeling its sharp edges like a promise of justice that might never be fulfilled. Maybe. Or maybe I'd survive long enough to prove the truth eventually. Before Ruth could respond, a new voice called from the front of the inn. "Hello, anyone here? We need help." They hurried to the dining room to find Silas standing in the doorway, with his hat in his hands and worry etched deep in the lines around his eyes. Jacob peered around his uncle's legs, his young face bright with curiosity despite the late hour. He heard there was trouble brewing. Silas said simply, his quiet voice, carrying the kind of resolve that had built civilizations in hostile wilderness. "Thought you might need support." Clara felt her throat tighten with emotions she couldn't afford to indulge. Here was a man who'd already risked his reputation by associating with her, now willing to risk everything by openly defying Sheriff Brand's ultimatum. "Silas, you shouldn't be here. Brand just left and he's in a dangerous mood. Being seen with me could make you and Jacob targets. All the more reason to be here." Silas replied with the unshakable logic of someone who'd never learned to abandon friends when they needed help most. "What exactly did Brand say?" Ruth quickly explained the sheriff's ultimatum, while Clara struggled with the implications of Silas's presence. His support meant everything to her emotionally, but it also meant he and Jacob could become casualties if she chose to stay and fight. "Uncle Silas," Jacob said with a directness that made adults uncomfortable, "is Miss Fields really a thief, like people are saying?" Silas knelt to the boy's level, meeting his eyes with the same respect he'd show an adult. "What do you think, Jacob? You've spent time with Miss Fields. You've watched how she treats people, how she works, how she handles problems. Does she seem like someone who'd steal from others?" Jacob considered this with the seriousness children brought to questions that mattered. "I think she's kind and brave, and she fixes things instead of breaking them. I don't think thieves act like that." "Neither do I," Silas said, standing to face Clara directly. "Whatever you decide to do, you won't face it alone." The simple declaration nearly broke Clara's composure. After weeks of isolation and persecution, the offer of unconditional support felt like water in the desert or shelter in a killing storm, but it also crystallized her dilemma perfectly. The more people who stood with her, the more people Brand could hurt in retaliation. Her fight was becoming their fight, and she wasn't certain she had the right to make that choice for them. "Silas," she began, but he held up a hand to stop her. "Before you say anything about not wanting to involve us, there's something you need to know. Mrs. Patterson came by the ranch this afternoon very upset about something she wouldn't explain clearly. But she asked me to tell you that the lady asked too many questions about the repair work." Clara's blood turned to ice water in her veins. If Mrs. Brand had questioned Mrs. Patterson about the coat repair, it meant she suspected something had been discovered during the process. "There's more." Silas continued, his expression growing grimmer. "Jacob saw something while we were in town today that didn't seem important at the time. Tell Miss Fields what you witnessed, son." Jacob's expression grew troubled as he recalled the incident. "I saw Mrs. Brand coming out of the church when Father Miguel wasn't there. She looked around real careful-like, checking to make sure nobody was watching, then she walked away fast." The pieces clicked together in Clara's mind with devastating clarity. Mrs. Brand hadn't just stolen from the church poor box, she'd done it after Brand's visit to the inn, knowing that Clara would immediately be blamed for the theft. It was a deliberate escalation designed to justify whatever final action Brand planned to take. "She's cleaning up loose ends," Clara said grimly. "Getting rid of evidence, making sure nothing can be traced back to her, and providing Brand with the justification he needs for extreme measures." "Then you can't leave town," Ruth said fiercely. "If you run now, she wins completely. She keeps stealing, keeps destroying people's lives, and you carry the blame forever." Clara looked around the room at Ruth's determined face, at Silas's quiet strength, at Jacob's innocent faith in her fundamental goodness. These people believed in her innocence and were willing to fight for it, even at personal cost to themselves. The brooch in her pocket seemed to pulse with possibility. One piece of evidence wasn't enough to convict Mrs. Brand, but it might be sufficient to plant doubt, to force a real investigation, to shift the narrative from Clara's guilt to questions about the real culprit. "All right," Clara said quietly, her voice carrying a resolve that surprised even her. "I'll stay and fight. But if this goes wrong, if Brand comes after any of you because of me, I'll never forgive myself. If we let you face this alone when we could have helped." Silas replied, "We'll never forgive ourselves." Outside, the wind was picking up again, with the promise of another desert storm carrying the scent of dust and distant lightning. Clara could hear voices in the street, men calling to each other, the sound of footsteps and horses moving with purpose. Brand was already assembling his forces, preparing for whatever he planned to do when midnight arrived. Clara had 3.5 hours to figure out how to use one stolen brooch to bring down a sheriff's wife and save her own life. The odds weren't encouraging, but they were better than running into the desert to die of thirst or exposure. And Clara Fields had survived worse odds before, though never with so much at stake. At 11:30, Clara made her move. She'd spent the intervening hours planning with Ruth and Silas, working out a desperate gambit that required perfect timing and more luck than any reasonable person had a right to expect. Jacob had been sent to sleep in Ruth's private quarters, safely away from whatever violence the night might bring. Clara wrapped the stolen brooch in a clean handkerchief and tucked it securely into her bodice, where it couldn't be easily found or lost. Then she walked out the inn's front door into a night that crackled with the kind of tension that preceded either thunderstorms or bloodshed. Ember Creek's main street was alive, with flickering torches and angry voices. Brand had assembled nearly 40 men miners down from the hills, drifters who lived on the margins of society, and townspeople who'd been drinking at the saloon since sunset. They clustered in small groups along the wooden sidewalks, their faces hard with righteous fury and liquid courage. Clara walked directly toward them, her head high, despite the terror clawing at her chest like a living thing. This was either the bravest or the most foolish thing she'd ever done, but it was the only path that led toward any kind of future worth having. As she approached, conversations stopped, and faces turned toward her with hostile anticipation. The crowd parted slightly, creating a corridor that led directly to Sheriff Brand, who stood in front of the saloon with his thumbs hooked in his gun belt. "Where's Sheriff Brand?" Clara called, her voice carrying clearly in the desert air. "I understand you wanted to speak with me about recent events." Brand emerged from his supporters like a predator leaving cover, his hand resting on his weapon in a gesture designed to remind everyone present who held ultimate authority. "Finally decided to face the music, did you?" "I've decided to tell the truth," Clara replied, stopping about 10 feet away, close enough to be heard clearly, but far enough to run if necessary. All of it to everyone present. A murmur rippled through the crowd, like wind through dry grass. This wasn't what they'd expected. Most had come, anticipating either Clara's tearful confession of guilt or her desperate flight into the desert. "The truth is," Clara continued, raising her voice so everyone could hear, "I did find stolen property today. Mrs. Morrison's pearl brooch, the one taken from her jewelry box 3 nights ago." The crowd's attention sharpened like a blade being honed. Brand's eyes narrowed dangerously, but he couldn't stop her now without seeming to suppress evidence. "Where?" he demanded. "Hidden in a coat that was brought to me for repair. A coat that belongs to your wife, Sheriff Brand." The words hit the assembled crowd like a physical blow. Men shifted uncomfortably, glancing at each other with confusion and growing suspicion. This wasn't the confession they'd come to hear, and the implications were staggering. Brand's face flushed dark red with rage. "That's a goddamn lie, and you know it." Is it? Clara pulled the wrapped brooch from her bodice, holding it high so everyone could see the evidence. Then explain how this got sewn into the seam of Mrs. Brand's coat, a coat she's worn regularly for months. Judge Morrison pushed through the crowd with the authority that came from years of commanding respect in frontier courtrooms. Let me examine that evidence. Clara handed him the jewelry, watching as he unwrapped it carefully and held it up to the torchlight. His expression confirmed what everyone already knew. This was indeed his wife's stolen property. Where exactly did you find this, Miss Fields? Morrison asked. Worked deep into the seam of the coat's right pocket. It had been there long enough to wear a groove in the fabric lining. Clara's voice was steady, but her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Mrs. Patterson brought the coat for repair, saying it belonged to someone who couldn't afford regular seamstress prices. Mrs. Patterson. Brand shouted, his composure cracking like ice in spring. Get out here and tell these people what really happened. The crowd parted to reveal Mrs. Patterson being pushed forward by two of Brand's men, her face pale with fear, but her expression resolute. When she saw Clara standing alone against the mob, something hardened in her eyes. It's true, she said clearly, her voice carrying across the suddenly quiet street. Mrs. Brand asked me to take her coat for repair. She said she couldn't be seen helping Miss Fields directly because of how the sheriff felt about the situation. My wife never asked any such thing. Brand snarled, but his protest sounded desperate rather than convincing. You're both lying to save each other's skins. Then let's ask her directly. Judge Morrison said with the calm authority that had made him respected across 3 territories. Where is Mrs. Brand? A new tension rippled through the crowd as men realized that in all the weeks of accusations and investigations, the sheriff's wife had remained curiously invisible, never speaking publicly about the thefts, never adding her voice to the chorus of condemnation against Clara. She's home where decent women belong at this hour, Brand said defensively, but his voice carried a note of panic that hadn't been there before. Then we'll go ask her, Morrison declared, gesturing to several men in the crowd. Escort the sheriff to his house. We'll get to the bottom of this matter right now. Brand's face went white as understanding hit him. You can't just barge into a man's home. I can and I will. This woman has made a serious accusation backed by physical evidence. Your wife deserves the chance to respond to these charges publicly. The procession that formed was unlike anything Ember Creek had ever witnessed, 40 torch-bearing men marching through the streets like an ancient mob, but led by legal authority rather than vigilante justice. Clara walked between Morrison and Silas, acutely aware that her life balanced on the edge of the next few minutes. The Brand house sat on a small rise overlooking the main street, a neat 2-story building that spoke of prosperity unusual for a sheriff's salary. Lamplight glowed in the front windows, suggesting Mrs. Brand was still awake despite the late hour. Morrison knocked firmly on the front door. Mrs. Brand. This is Judge Morrison. I need to speak with you about an urgent legal matter. The door opened to reveal a woman in her 30s, thin and nervous, with prematurely gray hair and darting eyes that immediately sought her husband's face. Clara watched her take in the crowd and the torches, the grim expressions, and saw fear bloom across her features like a poisonous flower. Judge Morrison, she said faintly, her voice barely above a whisper. What's wrong? What's happened? Mrs. Brand, this woman claims she found your stolen brooch hidden in your coat, a coat you asked Mrs. Patterson to take for repair. Morrison held up the jewelry so she could see it clearly. Can you explain how this came to be there? Mrs. Brand's face went completely white, all color draining away, as if someone had opened her veins. Her gaze flicked from the brooch to Clara, to her husband, and Clara saw the exact moment when she realized her carefully constructed deception was crumbling like a house built on sand. I don't know what you mean. She stammered, her hands fluttering helplessly. I've never seen that woman before in my life. But you did give Mrs. Patterson a coat for repair. Morrison pressed relentlessly. Mrs. Brand's voice failed her completely. And this is your brooch stolen from my wife's jewelry box. Mrs. Brand's silence was more damning than any confession. The crowd began to murmur with growing understanding as the implications became clear. Brand stepped forward desperately, his authority evaporating like water in desert heat. You're confusing her with all these questions, Judge. Margaret's been ill, she's not thinking clearly. I'm thinking perfectly clearly. Mrs. Brand said suddenly, her voice sharp with hysteria that had been building for weeks. Clear enough to know I'm tired of covering for your mistakes and living in fear of your creditors. The words seemed to surprise her as much as everyone else. Brand grabbed her arm roughly, his mask of authority completely gone. Margaret, don't what? Don't tell them how you forced me to steal because your gambling debts were going to get us both killed. Her voice rose to a near scream that carried across the desert night. Don't tell them how you said the fat woman was perfect to take the blame because nobody would believe her word against ours. The crowd erupted in shocked voices and angry curses. Clara felt her knees go weak with relief and vindication. After weeks of accusations and persecution, the truth was finally emerging like sunlight after a long, dark storm. But Brand wasn't finished. His face twisted with rage and desperation, he drew his gun and pointed it directly at Clara's chest. None of this matters. He snarled his voice, carrying the dangerous edge of a man with nothing left to lose. She's still a lying troublemaker who came here to destroy our town. Some problems need permanent solutions. The crowd scattered as men dove for cover behind buildings and wagons. Clara found herself standing alone in the circle of torchlight, staring down the barrel of Brand's gun and knowing she had perhaps 3 seconds to live. Then Silas stepped between them. You'll have to go through me first, he said quietly, his voice carrying the calm certainty of a man who'd made peace with whatever came next. Brand's gun wavered as he faced this unexpected obstacle. Get out of the way, Boone. This isn't your fight. A man threatening an innocent woman, that's everybody's fight. Ruth appeared on Clara's other side, her face grim with determination. Mine too. Mrs. Patterson pushed through the crowd to stand with them, followed by the blacksmith, then the storekeeper, then others, who'd remained silent too long. The circle around Clara and Brand widened, but the protective barrier of bodies remained firm. Brand's hand shook as he realized his support was evaporating like morning dew. You're all making a terrible mistake. She's a criminal, a liar. The only criminal here is standing behind that gun, Morrison said coldly. Put it down, Marcus. It's over. For a moment, Clara thought Brand might surrender. His shoulders sagged with defeat, and the gun barrel dropped slightly toward the ground. Then his wife spoke again. I'm sorry, Clara. I never wanted anyone to get hurt. But Marcus said if we didn't keep stealing, the men he owed money to would come for us both. The mention of outside threats, dangerous men who'd bring real violence to Ember Creek, seemed to snap something fundamental in Brand's mind. His gun came up again, but this time it pointed at his wife. You stupid bitch, he hissed with venom that made several people step backward. You've destroyed everything we built here. Clara moved without thinking, throwing herself sideways to knock Mrs. Brand out of the line of fire. The gun went off with a deafening roar, the bullet sparking off the stone steps where the woman had been standing just moments before. Before Brand could fire again, half the crowd was on him. The gun went flying as he was wrestled to the ground, his curses and threats lost in the chaos of shouting voices and struggling bodies. When the dust settled, Brand lay in the dirt with his hands bound behind his back, while Judge Morrison stood over him with the recovered weapon. Marcus Brand, Morrison said with formal gravity. You're under arrest for theft, conspiracy, threatening citizens with a deadly weapon, and attempted murder. Mrs. Brand, you'll also need to answer for your role in these crimes, though your cooperation will be noted. Mrs. Brand was crying now, great heaving sobs that shook her thin frame like a fever. I never wanted to hurt anyone. I just wanted the stealing to stop, but Marcus said we were in too deep, that we had to keep going until we had enough money to disappear completely. Clara knelt beside the distraught woman, offering the comfort of human contact despite everything that had happened. It's over now. No more lies, no more fear. Can you ever forgive me? Mrs. Brand whispered through her tears. I destroyed your reputation. Made your life hell, all to protect a man who would have killed me anyway when he got desperate enough. Clara thought about the weeks of persecution, the whispered accusations, the constant fear and isolation. Then she thought about the courage it had taken for Mrs. Brand to finally speak the truth, even knowing it would destroy her life. We all do things we regret when we're frightened, Clara said gently. The important thing is that you found the courage to stop. As the crowd began to disperse and Brand was led away to the makeshift jail, Clara found herself surrounded by townspeople offering apologies and gratitude. The same people who'd shunned her days earlier now pressed forward to shake her hand and express their shame at how she'd been treated. But Clara barely heard their words. Her attention was fixed on Silas, who stood quietly at the edge of the group watching her with an expression she'd never seen before. Not pity, not charity, but something warmer and infinitely more precious. When the crowd finally thinned, he approached her with Jacob at his side. Miss Fields, the boy said solemnly, Uncle Silas says you're the bravest person in the whole territory. Clara knelt to Jacob's level, her heart full of emotions she couldn't name. I think your uncle might be a little biased. No, Silas said quietly. I think he's exactly right. The trial of Marcus and Margaret Brand dominated Ember Creek for the next 2 weeks, with Judge Morrison presiding over proceedings that drew spectators from across the territory. Clara testified with quiet dignity, walking the packed courtroom through her discovery of the brooch and the systematic campaign of persecution that had followed. Margaret Brand pleaded guilty to her role in the thefts, receiving a reduced sentence in exchange for her testimony against her husband. Brand himself was sentenced to 10 years in territorial prison, his corruption exposed for all to see. But for Clara, the real victory came in smaller moments, the way people nodded respectfully. When she passed on the street the invitations to join community organizations, the children who no longer threw stones, but instead waved shyly from behind their mothers' skirts. 3 months after the trial, as spring transformed the desert into something approaching beauty, Silas made his proposal on the front porch of the ranch house, while Jacob helped with the evening chores. Clara, he said, turning his hat nervously in his hands. I've been thinking about what you said that first day about finding your place in the world. I remember. Well, Jacob and I were hoping. That is, we can't imagine our lives without you in them. He took a deep breath and started over. Will you marry me, not out of charity or convenience, but because we love you, not despite what you've been through, but because of how you faced it with courage and grace? Jacob appeared around the corner of the house, bouncing with excitement. Say yes, Miss Fields. We already cleaned out the spare room, and I made a list of all the projects we could work on together. Clara laughed through sudden tears. You made a list. 23 items. Jacob confirmed seriously. Starting with building you a proper sewing room and ending with teaching me to make my own clothes. Clara looked at these two people who'd stood by her when the rest of the world seemed determined to destroy her Silas, whose quiet strength had sustained her through the darkest weeks, and Jacob, whose innocent faith had reminded her of her own worth. Yes, she said simply. They were married 6 weeks later in a ceremony that brought together nearly the entire community. Ruth served as matron of honor, while Mrs. Patterson organized a wedding feast that lasted well into the evening. Even Margaret Brand attended, having been released early for good behavior, bringing a handmade quilt as a wedding gift and tearful apologies for the pain she'd caused. The celebration continued past sunset, with music and dancing in the street outside the church. As the evening wound down and guests began to depart, Clara found herself standing with her new family on the inn's front porch, watching the sun disappear behind the desert mountains. "What are you thinking about?" Silas asked, slipping his arm around her waist. "About belonging," Clara said, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. "I thought it was something that happened to you, something you were born into, or lucky enough to find. I didn't realize it was something you had to fight for." Jacob leaned against her other side, his young face serious in the fading light. "Do you think we'll be happy here?" Clara looked down at this boy, who'd become her son in all the ways that mattered then, at the man who'd seen past her size and circumstances to the woman beneath. Around them, Ember Creek settled into evening quiet, a community that had learned hard lessons about judgment and justice. "I think we'll build happiness here," she said, "day by day, the same way we build fences and mend clothes and tend gardens." "And together," Silas added quietly. "Together," Clara agreed. As the desert wind sang through the cottonwoods and the first coyotes began their nightly chorus in the hills, Clara Fields stood with her family and understood that she'd finally found what she'd been searching for all her life. Not just a place to belong, but the courage to make herself worthy of belonging. The mail-order bride who'd been rejected as too fat had become a woman who saved children exposed corruption and helped heal a broken community. But more than that, she'd become exactly who she was meant to be. A woman who belonged not because she fit in, but because she'd found the strength to stand up for what was right. The desert stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, and Clara Fields was finally completely home.